For the month of November, we will consider the concept of forgiveness. So what is forgiveness? Well, it can be different things, but generally it's a conscious, deliberate ability, sometimes maybe a gift, to release the feelings of resentment or hostility towards someone who's harmed you, regardless of whether they deserve your forgiveness or not. Forgiveness is part of the corrective process required for us to heal spiritually after we've been hurt, after we've been damaged. Life does not always go as it should. And after serious disappointments or after abuse, we need a pathway or a process that leads us to healing. If we don't heal properly, after things go terribly wrong, we can become depressed, bitter. We might lose the ability to enjoy life. Forgiveness is sometimes thought of as the final step in that healing process. And it often does take some degree of effort to get there. But we could also use the term forgiveness to describe the whole process, from when we first begin to recover from being hurt, as we grow to recognize that we need to forgive, until we at last fully are healed and have arrived at forgiveness. That's what forgiveness is in terms of the Christian tradition. It's a healing process. And at least at first, it's also a grieving process, a mourning process. There's often loss associated with our need to forgive, a loss of trust, a loss of a relationship, a loss of a feeling of safety. And there are some common barriers to forgiveness that are helpful to know about. For example, forgiveness is not the same thing as moving on. Have you ever heard someone say that? I'm just moving on from that. It's kind of a modern concept which is sometimes confused with forgiveness, but it's not really the same thing. When a person moves on, that person tries to go beyond their painful situation, trying not to let what happened influence their emotions, thoughts, their behaviors. And that's good. Moving on can be a step towards forgiveness, but we need to be careful that it does not become a replacement for it or become a technique of denial. Just moving on too often means that we've not done the hard work of totally resolving the wrong in our life. Moving on can be more of an attempt to forget or to go into denial, rather than an act of compassion and mercy that repairs and heals. Moving on tries to forget the wrong, while forgiveness resolves the wrong in a way that the memory of the wrong will no longer have any negative impact on us. If we've just moved on, then the memory of the wrong is still going to hurt. If we've fully forgiven, that's not the case. And oh, by the way, forgiveness takes work. Most of us do not. So if we've not done the work, assume that you haven't arrived at forgiveness yet. Moving on can hold us back in ways that we may not even notice, isolating us and distancing us from others. The process of forgiveness spiritually does the opposite. If the hurt and abuse has stopped, forgiveness moves us towards the person who hurt us, through kindness, respect, generosity, and love, with the possibility of reconciliation. A forgiver does not necessarily reconcile with the other person if the other person's behavior doesn't change or it otherwise doesn't make sense to do so. If their behavior continues to be hurtful, then forgiveness still makes sense, but reconciliation may not make sense. But one such goal of forgiveness is to offer the other person a chance to make those changes. Forgiveness is not denying or forgetting the seriousness of an offense against you, and it's not condoning or excusing someone's offenses either. It doesn't make it okay what happened. Forgiving someone does not necessarily release somebody from legal accountability, for instance. You can forgive someone and still support legal proceedings to hold that person accountable to the law or to ensure the safety of others. The ability to forgive in healing and transformative ways is a spiritual gift, one that we develop as we grow closer to Christ and we experience Christ's forgiveness. So how do we develop the ability to forgive? Don't just assume that you're good at it. Today's New Testament scripture deals with forgiveness in some ways and more. It was a letter written to the Colossian church, and this letter is attributed to Paul, who's writing to the Colossian church to deal with some problems and conflicts they're having at the time. People were fighting with each other and becoming bitter and leaving the church. Oh, by the way, maybe that still happens today, even in modern society. Maybe we haven't grown as much as we'd like to think when it comes to this seemingly simple concept of forgiveness. The letter to the Colossians tells us to clothe ourselves in compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. To take off our old coat of self-centeredness and cruelty, and instead to put on a new coat of compassion, kindness, humility, and patience. The analogy of a garment or coat is interesting, and I think important to understand. At first, these traits, these positive traits, can be like a coat, as just something that's external, as something we put on when we engage in outward acts of kindness and humility, even if we don't feel that way on the inside. Put on a coat of kindness. But by starting to practice these virtues, even if they're just on the outside, as if they're just putting a coat on, moves us in the right direction. Eventually, through consistent practice of kindness, these qualities change us on the inside. Just the practice of kindness makes us more kind on the inside. We don't have to wait until we're kind on the inside to be kind on the outside. Does that make sense? Just like when we put a coat on, our outside, we're eventually warmed on the inside, right? It takes time. These are practical instructions, and by the way, recent scientific studies have shown that this actually is how it works, that this actually does work. So these are really practical instructions on spiritual growth process and to be more Christ-like in our lives. And that is, start acting that way first, and it will transform your insides as well. Then we're told to forgive each other just as God has forgiven us. God forgives, and so we're to do the same. Now, are there ever times that forgiveness does not make sense? Yes. Yeah, there are. Forgiveness, when engaged in prematurely, when someone is still in danger, can actually make a situation much worse. Forgiveness must be used with care, because in certain circumstances, forgiveness can become part of a cycle of abuse. When forgiveness becomes an enabler of a cycle of abuse, then we are not applying forgiveness, we are allowing abuse. Are you aware of the cycle of abuse I'm talking about? It's important to know about this. It's a classic pattern. It happens in a lot of families, in domestic abuse cases in particular. But it can arise in other types of relationship as well. The simplest model of this cycle has 3 stages. First, pressure builds, usually in a close relationship, and usually over little things. And the building of pressure or tension or anger, that's the first stage. And then eventually, that pressure erupts into physical abuse. Physical abuse is the second stage. Then the abuser feels bad about the abuse and promises to change and seeks forgiveness. When forgiveness is granted and reconciliation occurs, then there's a period of relative happiness known as the honeymoon stage, and that's the third stage. But after the honeymoon, if things really haven't changed at a fundamental level after the honeymoon stage, pressure starts to build again, and we're back to the first stage. And another explosion occurs, more violence. This can go on and on and on. And if this cycle is not stopped, either in your life or if you see this happening to somebody else, know that if this cycle is not stopped, it's going to lead to death or serious injury. This is a cycle that must be stopped And forgiveness applied wrongly can add fuel to the fire, can make the cycle go and continue on. The key thing to notice is that the abuser's behavior never really fundamentally changes. Or if it did change, it was temporary. You don't need to go through this abuse cycle more than a few times before you realize that that's what's going on. Or if you see this going on in your family or in your friends. The abuse cycle is complicated, and there are many factors to consider. Often the person being abused will blame themselves for the abuse, making forgiving the abuser easier, and leading to reconciliation that never should have been considered to begin with. If you're being abused, it is not your fault. Ever. I mean, in some cases of self-defense, but generally speaking, in a domestic situation, no. The forgiveness process cannot move forward if we're still in danger, if safety is still in question. Forgiving someone who's likely to hurt us again is not really forgiveness, it's cooperating with the abuse. Real forgiveness can only begin from a position of safety. Effective forgiveness does not enable abuse, it stops it. An effective process of forgiveness first removes the abuse and establishes safety. That's part of the process of forgiveness, establishing safety. Forgiveness also does not set the abuser free to abuse another. Once safety has been established for yourself and others, once the abuser has been stopped, we need to heal. And that healing includes a grieving process coupled with a forgiveness process. Grieving because of our pain, grieving because of lost relationships, grieving because things didn't go like they should have gone. And in almost all situations involving forgiveness, forgiving others is directly connected to our ability to forgive ourselves. Again, not that we're to blame for abuse, but nonetheless, when we get abused or misused, or if we hurt others, the need to forgive ourselves should not be overlooked. Often we don't think of it though, or we don't think it's needed. And it can be hard to do. However, neglecting the difficult work of self-forgiveness chips away at our self-worth, particularly if we make the mistake of blaming ourselves for the abuse. Have you ever known someone to engage in bad behavior as a form of self-punishment? Who engaged in bad behavior or cut themselves because they felt that they deserved it? Feeling like you deserve abuse is a huge failure in self-forgiveness. Forgiving ourselves sometimes takes outside help. Talking to others, talking to the pastor, talking to a professional counselor, talking to a close friend you can trust, which may be difficult to do, but is vital to our spiritual health. We can tell that we need that kind of outside help when we can't move past our fixations, our self-incrimination, when we can't find forgiveness on our own. Too often when we can't find forgiveness on our own, we ignore it, we think it's gone, we try to move on. This is hard work. Another aspect of forgiveness that's often overlooked is the ability to forgive a community or forgive a large group of people. There are many cases when we hold grudges against groups of people rather than individuals. We as a people have historically held grudges against entire races, against entire religions, against the government, against each other. Such grudges are poisonous to us and to our spiritual health, just as much as grudges against individuals. But they're harder for us to see, and therefore harder to address. For example, in America today, one of the deepest grudges are aimed at political parties. With elections coming up this Tuesday, those grudges are front and center right now. Anyone notice that? No? No. We see the emotional, political divisions. We experience the political grudges, but we often fail to understand the process well enough to do anything about it. And how many of us realize that political healing can only be done through a process of forgiveness? Forgiving entire groups is tricky for a number of reasons. First, most of our reasons for holding grudges against large groups is usually based on falsehoods, on scapegoating, rather than on reality. Also, just in the case of individuals, abuse must end before forgiveness can begin. Such abuse can be hard to pin down when dealing with large groups of people, since almost always the abuse is not really coming from the entire group, but from a few representatives of that group. And keep in mind that there are groups whose sole purpose is to abuse, whose sole purpose is to spread hate propaganda. Those are sometimes known as hate groups, or they can be foreign nations who wish to damage our country. The rules of forgiveness indicate that we should not reconcile groups like that until the abuse stops. That's the first order of business. Forgiveness is not usually the right tool for dealing with abuse or with abusers, no matter if they are individuals or groups. We need tools that stop the abuse or that neutralize it. If we hold enough grudges against enough groups or people, or we hold a grudge against life. Have you ever met somebody or been in that place yourself where you had a grudge against life or a grudge against God? Have you ever had a grudge against God? Like, God, why did you give me this problem? And it's really easy to blame God, right? But blaming God pushes God away. Loving God involves pulling God close, and that can only be done effectively within a context of forgiveness. Sometimes we have trouble forgiving God for life's mysteries, such as death, for the suffering of innocent people. Today is All Saints' Day, a day that we set aside to remember those who have recently passed. And this issue of forgiving God is often part of the process we need to go through surrounding the death of someone we love. When someone dies, the grieving process, if done well, will include a significant element of forgiveness. Almost all of us have or will have to deal with this kind of massive loss. The loss of someone we love, the loss of parents or children or a best friend, and it will devastate us. Most of us have been through it more than once. And maybe we are experiencing some resentment or guilt over something that happened over the loss. Maybe we, in a roundabout way, feel we contributed to the death. And how do we deal with that? How do we get to forgiveness? Death in and of itself seems abusive, unjust, and counter to the law of love. Can we forgive God for designing reality in this manner? I think the answer is yes. We have no other healthy choice. Few things destroy joy more effectively than carrying around unnecessary grudges, particularly grudges against those we've lost to death, or against God, or against large groups of people. Because who carries the grudge? The abuser or the abused? Learning to forgive leads to a life freed of unnecessary baggage, a life that is more open to improving our relationship with God and with each other. And it's not like turning a switch. There's not a forgiveness switch for most of us. And if there is, you're probably moving on and not really doing the hard work of forgiveness. It's a process. And it's a process that we can easily underestimate if we're not careful. Once safety is in place, forgiveness brings the forgiver peace of mind and frees us from corrosive anger, from bitterness, from hostility, allowing us to live life as it is intended to be lived. Allows us to live life as an expression of love. Did you know our inability to live life as an expression of love is connected to our ability to forgive? Directly connected. Let's keep forgiveness in mind today as we celebrate All Saints' Day. As part of our grieving process, as part of our healing efforts, and as we deal with the upcoming election, that we learn to forgive just as we have been forgiven.